Dr. Glenn Kolomeitz, thank you for joining me back on the podcast. You've been on before. We did a large just piece about military law in general. I'll actually link that below. That was probably over a year ago. But
Yeah.
you reached out, you and I text back and forward about, just some military law stuff. And of course, what we have seen, of course, is Mr. Oscar Jenkins pop up, an Australian who has been taken prisoner by the Russian forces. And you have really been at the forefront talking to the media, both domestic and international, about this situation. So you and I today are welcome back, firstly, but we're going to go over all of that. So, mate, thank you for coming on.
Thanks, mate. Thanks for having me back. It's been a while, but it's always good to talk to you. And look, I appreciate your podcast, mate. They're very helpful.
Oh, mate, no, thank you very much. So just in like a too long didn't read, who are you and what is your background, like your accreditations?
Mate, I'm an international law consultant and a defence analyst. I have my own practice, but I consult to a couple of other firms, to a firm in the UK, and a firm which it's UK based, but it works in Ukraine on occasion. A lot of that is open source intelligence work, but it's legal work, international law work predominantly. I also teach international criminal law at various universities and international law more broadly. And I used to teach intelligence at university. Background, soldier turned Air Force officer, in fact, operations officer involved in targeting. Then New South Wales Police, and ended up in counter-terrorism there, and coronial investigations. But at the same time, went to the Army Reserves, a military police officer, got out of the coppers and went to Parliament House as a defence policy advisor. And then went back to the regular army, eventually getting into legal corps actually as a lawyer, and did Timor and Afghanistan a couple of times as the legal officer in Afghanistan with the Special Operations Task Group. Came back, became a military prosecutor, and then got out and started doing some of the stuff I'm doing now. So I've done stuff in Ukraine in recent years, in the last couple of years, and I've been doing some advice work regarding Ukraine and Israel and elsewhere.
Yes. And I guess the development as of today, because you and I were meant to speak a couple of days back, but of course you were caught up in the big storms, but I'm sort of glad it got delayed because Mr. Simon Boykov, who people will know more as Aussie Cossack, who's currently actually in the Russian consulate in Australia, he has come out and sharing Russian media saying that no, Mr. Jenkins is alive and he will be prosecuted under, the criminal code there. And I reached out to Mr. Cossack himself. He replied back to me with no, that he is alive. Now, I will say that there is no beyond reasonable doubt. There is no, I asked, is there evidence? He sent me then the link to the Russian media article. Of course, I'd want to see proof of life to put anything beyond that, because of course there is incentive for a narrative here. There is an incentive for Russia to have him alive, especially at this point when Australia is saying, we'll be pretty severe on what will happen here. But of course, there is, and you and I spoke about this and I mentioned on the podcast, there is incentive the other way for this narrative, that if he was even caught in crossfire, there is incentive because a lot of the war for Ukraine, it's informational war, is part of its massive war because it does not domestically produce and fund the war. It's externally off partners, Australia being one of them. That's why this is so messy. Now, you and I are sitting here, and I hope everyone in the audience hope that Mr. Jenkins does come alive. I think that is highly, I think it's very unlikely at this point in time with my interactions with other members serving in the Foreign Legion. But I just wanted to give, what was your 2 cents on this? Because I believe you were somewhat misinterpreted and or misquoted in some of these articles about execution.
Look, firstly, I agree entirely with everything you said, mate. You're spot on. This is an information operations war on both sides, and as a lot of conflict, most conflicts are now. And we have to be careful with narratives. And I agree entirely. We shouldn't be. Look, I'm a lawyer and an analyst, mate. So I live in the world of proof, not evidence, of proof. And depending on what the standard of proof is, of course, it varies. But we shouldn't be definitively saying, yes, Oscar is dead, because we don't have that evidence. And we certainly shouldn't be definitively saying Oscar was executed, because we don't have that evidence, right? So we can look at what we do have and we can draw inferences, but we don't have the evidence to firstly, as I say, to say that he's dead. We haven't seen a body. We haven't had positive identification done, and quite frankly, a lot of what we're seeing now, even though there's evidentiary pieces allowing for an inference, we don't have, to my view, an adequate standard of evidence to be able to say he's dead. Now, I've done a lot of media in the last few days, and look, media is important because, firstly, we need to be sending a message to the various governments involved in this that we want our people looked after. Oscar's an Australian fighting for the Ukraine in Ukraine, but nonetheless, we want our people. So we send a message to the various countries, including our own government, via the media. And the messaging, I've been very careful to say, the narrative, the messaging has been that, as you said, it's possible, and we could say probable, that he is in fact, that Oscar is in fact dead, based on what we've seen and based on what our government has said. But I've been careful not to definitively say he's dead, and definitely not to definitively say he was executed by anybody, including the Russians. One particular media outlet made a bit of a mistake here. I received a message, or I've been getting messages from Ukraine, from people on the ground. You and I know people on the ground over there. And one message said that, and this is a quote, Oscar, he was executed. Now, I gave that, I was given permission to give that message to these media outlets, and one of the outlets ran an article and attributed that statement, he was executed, to me, which I've since arranged to have corrected. But which this is where I understand Mr. Boykov saying, well, hang on, Kolomeitz said this, and he's right. Kolomeitz can't prove this, right? What I do want to be able to prove, and this is where we can get help from Mr. Boykov or elsewhere, to either give us proof of life, us being Australia and Mr. Jenkins and Oscar's family, proof of life, or proof that he has in fact passed away, and how we can have access to his body, how we can get him home. So yes, a media outlet said that I said that he was executed. I didn't say that. That was in the message from Ukraine. A couple of other pieces there too. There was another piece in there that said that he was robbed. So he was interrogated and robbed by the Russians, presumably. Well, that was in the message. I didn't say that clearly, because again, where's that evidence, right? So there's a lot of people saying a lot of things, but I think we need to be putting a controlled narrative out there that yes, we had a captured Australian. Our government has said they have grave fear for his safety, grave fear that he's no longer alive, and we're getting a lot of information, both through formal and informal channels, through our channels on the ground in Ukraine and elsewhere, saying that he was in fact killed, but we don't know if it's true. We don't know how, because we don't have that evidence.
Yes, but this is one of the problems with a lot of this media that holds just such a one-way narrative that if it fits their narrative, they're not going to dig deeper on this. If it was vice versa, it would require the absolute nth degree of information, of evidence, of everything. But the other way, you don't really need it. I guess it's why people like me can then make a living out of this.
Yeah.
Yourself spending time, in Ukraine, yourself being, a professional of law. What do you make of the idea of people saying guys that serve in the Legion or foreigners going to fight in Ukraine are mercenaries? What do you make of this?
That's a really good point, mate. And Russia has in fact said this, that if they capture legionnaires, and they've captured a few legionnaires over the years, as we know, they are mercenaries, and therefore they're prosecuted by Russian authorities and potentially locked up for X number of years or life. They're potentially locked up, convicted and locked up. Firstly, at international law, and this is both codified international law and what they call customary international law, these legionnaires are not mercenaries. And I might just go through the law very briefly just to clarify this. Okay,
is that as long as they've signed a contract? What if they
that's exactly it. There's a bunch of criteria, right? I'll give you the facts first, and I'll just apply the law. Yeah. So, so, so look, our legionnaires, any legionnaire from any country who joins the International Legion in Ukraine, they have an identification issued by the government of Ukraine, a military identification. They wear Ukrainian uniform. They have rank. They wear Ukrainian uniform, Ukrainian weapons. Often serve with Ukrainian units, not always, but more often than not, they're paid. And this is a really important point, right? They're paid the same money, or sometimes less, than what Ukrainian soldiers of equivalent position. The law says rank, but legionnaires don't have rank, so equivalent position to their Ukrainian counterparts. That's a key point. And the law on this says that they're motivated. A mercenary is specially recruited, taking a part in the fight. So far, yes, tick, tick. But their motivation is a desire for private gain. Now, you and I know that you don't go to Ukraine and join the Legion for private monetary gain, because you just don't get paid much, right?
Does it have to be monetary gain? Does it specify that? Because we do see a lot of people, and a lot of people going for ability to make money online other than salary to increase, I guess, their social standing too. Because I've spoken to guys who are, and you can go back through my podcast and watch this. No, I don't really care. I just wanted to blow up a tank.
Well, that's a good point. So the legislation's, the process additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, Article 47. That's the current law. There's also an international convention about mercenaries, but not only a few countries signed up to it. Australia's not one, right? But so it essentially that reflects Protocol 1, Article 47 anyway. But it says motivated by a desire for private gain, and they're promised or paid material compensation substantially in excess of that promised or paid to Ukrainian combatants, right? So private gain, yes, quite broad. That could be anything, right? Really, private gain, that's the motivation. But they're promised or given material compensation. So, and it says paid, not in excess of, not substantially in excess of what's paid to the Ukrainians. So that, on its face, that means money. That means pay, right? Or material compensation is related to pay. It's receiving something that you can use. Now, using it for professional purposes, that's way outside that definition, because it's firstly, it's not material. Like I can put things on my CV, and in the future it may help me get a job, or it may help me do something, but it's not material at the moment, right? It's a potential in the future that I may have some sort of material gain in the future. So it very much turns on what they're getting at the time, right? So that's the big difference. And it talks about other things there about not being a member of the armed forces. When you join the Legion, and you know this as well as I do, when you join the Legion, you're given an ID. You report to the Ukrainian chain of command. You're given a Ukrainian uniform. You're a member of the armed forces of Ukraine, for all intents and purposes, even though you're an international legionnaire. So that's another. It's another distancing of legionnaires from these mercenary provisions.
What about some that have not signed contracts? Because there are a lot of guys who will refer to, oh no, I haven't signed a contract. I'm here, I'm armed, and I'm doing this.
Yeah.
And I'm fundraising online. So I guess it doesn't fit the criteria for a material gain. If they're there as a privateer, what are they? Because everyone is protected under these international humanitarian laws and customs. So this idea that if you capture someone from Wagner PMC, from the Foreign Legion, or someone volunteering with a gun, that you can kneel them down and shoot them, that is just incorrect. You and I don't need to go through the law on that. Although many do hold that to be the law from Wagner to foreign fighters. But if they are there without a contract signed, with a weapon, with body armor, they're raising money to buy night vision goggles and fight, and rocking up in a privately bought car to fight, what protections are they offered? Would that meet mercenary? Would that meet something else?
Look, that's a really good point, mate. And I probably should have elaborated on the mercenary provision in the protocol. It starts off, a mercenary, so somebody who meets that definition, right, shall not have the right to be a combatant or a prisoner of war. This is the point you raised. Prisoners of war under international law have a whole bunch of protections, one of which is that they can't be prosecuted for taking part in the fight, because you're a lawful combatant, you're allowed to fight, right? So they don't have these protections, but at the same time, they do have protections. They can't be arbitrarily executed. They have to be treated well. They can't be tortured, etc. So there are some protections there, but not to the extent that prisoners of war have, and they can't be prosecuted. So this is where the Russian prosecution of captured legionnaires comes astray. All right. Now the point about the people that are over there without a contract, if they haven't, presumably they've got no Ukrainian ID. If they're getting, this breaks it down. If they're getting paid, so there could be a parallel contract. There could be anything saying, "Yep, you're fighting for us. Here's your uniform. Here's your weapon." So that's a contractual arrangement, regardless of having signed something. The test then would turn on their motivation to be there. Are they looking for private gain? Is it their gain, or if they're like you use the word privateer? Are they out there for their own personal gain, or is it for another reason, another motivation? And then pay. Who's paying them? Right? Is it the government of Ukraine paying them, or promising to pay them? And is that promise or that payment substantially in excess of what the Ukrainian soldiers of a similar position are getting? Now, if those criteria aren't satisfied, like the negative criteria, then in fact they could be classified as mercenaries, right? But I suspect on the fact you've given, those privateers are essentially engaged with Ukraine and are getting paid by Ukraine. Is my assumption based on what you said.
Right. Yeah, I think some of the screws have been tightened on the Foreign Legion, because in the beginning, in those beginning couple of months, it was cowboys out there with weapons wanting to blow up a tank. And the reason why this got tightened up was because it was like, who's who in the zoo. You could buy a weapon off the street that was given for a few $100s when they were being handed out. And the grey area on this is massive. And the grey area not only becomes what happens if you're captured or killed or wounded for Russia, it also becomes grey area for Ukraine too. That hang on, if this guy gets a leg blown off, who's responsible to pull him out of the front line to look after him or do this or that? And people can go back through my interviews and see where guys had to then acquire civilian vehicles to pull out of countries and get funding for treatment, because it's you don't have a contract. What are you doing here? You crossed the border and you've been fighting at the front. But under Australia's laws, they're going and fighting for another group or nation. Where does our law sit on this? Because it seems that has a grey line. Now, we'll speak about Oscar and then we'll speak about other soldiers, because other soldiers may have held clearances, security clearances. But where is that line drawn? Because it seems like the line is drawn at countries of which we consider friendly. If you went and fought for X, Y, or Z, then it is illegal. It can be the government of the day who see that. So where does the law sit on that?
It's a really good point, and this is some of the advice I was giving to all the legionnaires I advised and worked with for all ex-military from the various countries, right, and including a number of Australians. So I advised a number of Australians initially about our law, and then advised some of the other nations' legionnaires on international law aspects, and indeed some of their own domestic law aspects, right? But our point about Australians is, if we have a civilian, so a person who hasn't come from defence and from either the ADF or from Defence Public Service, has gone over there to fight, to Ukraine to fight, they don't fall foul of Australian legislation on those facts. I'll tell you, there's used to be a thing called the I'm just reading it, Foreign Incursions and Recruitment Act, which said it was an offence to go and to enter a foreign country with the intention to engage in hostile activity, unless you're serving in the armed forces of the government of that country. That's the big caveat, right? Now,
so what if someone signed up and go fight for the Russians though? Like that, what would be?
That's the then flow-on piece, right? There are then, and this has all been incorporated now into our criminal code. Okay, so there's a bunch of other clauses here. There are declared areas, so there are places that you can't go and engage in these activities, or with the intention to engage in these activities, hostile activities, right? There's a recruiting offence there. Now, one of the points here, when I say, I'm reading because it's a bit of a flowchart here, but one of the points about the engaging in a hostile activity includes the intention of achieving certain objectives, one of which was the overthrow by force or violence of the government of that or any other foreign country. So on the facts at the moment, if they went to fight for Russia, firstly, it would fall foul of the declared areas provisions. So somewhere it would say you can't go and fight for Russia. I haven't seen it, but it's bound to. But secondly, you're going there to fight Ukraine on Ukrainian territory. So there is an intention there to by force or violence affect the government of that country. In this instance, it is essentially to overthrow, if they're remaining in the east, a part of the government of that country, of Ukraine. But if it was to then advance further, it would be to and we know the intention early on was to, we understand, was to overthrow the government in Kyiv. So this is where they would fall foul. The rest of those provisions are about terrorism, right? Because this foreign fighters legislation was originally about people going to fight for Islamic State or Al Qaeda or other, but it certainly applies now. So our people should be aware, civilians who are going to. There's nothing on its face illegal about going to fight for Ukraine, provided you satisfy the test. Well, the test that you're not a mercenary. And there's nothing in the foreign fighters legislation that says you can't. That's if you're a civilian.
Do you advise these guys, because I've been asked a lot about this, and my advice has been not legal, but I've said be careful of which unit you are recruited into, because we do know that there are far right sectors. There are sectors of which, if it was another way in the world, would be seen as an enemy force. And there are areas of which, if you just need to look pre-2022 at Vice News and whatever, will paint one way, and now all of that is forgotten. Is there ever any advice on that? If no, it should be within the Ukraine Armed Forces and this, and not maybe X, Y, and Z, or a unit participating in X, Y, and Z.
Again, a good point. And it says serving in the armed forces of the government of a foreign country. Now, you'd be looking at the national legislation to say what the armed forces are, but some of these militia type units, and there's a few, as you know, there's a few particular units in Ukraine that are partisan or militia type units. If they're not under responsible command of a Ukrainian armed forces, an AFU chain of command, and not equipped by Ukraine, the reasonable outside looked at them and went, no, this is an independent force that is commanded by their own chain. They may have some supply from the Ukrainian military, but it's quite clear, the armed forces of the government. So I think, if you join the Legion, and particularly early on, where they sort of went, and you'd know this, we went where you were told, and it could have been anywhere really. I think I'm pretty sure nowadays that's been gripped up a bit. Nowadays, if a Legion is attached to a Ukrainian unit, then they're a Ukrainian Armed Forces field unit now. But you're right, there is some concern, and there were some units which in the early days, and I suspect there's still some there, which are too remote from the AFU to be considered part of the armed forces of the government of Ukraine.
You bring up there a point about, against invasion, overthrow of government. What do you make of then the foreign fighters who have participated, and some been wounded, not yet to my knowledge been captured, in the invasion back into Kursk? Yeah,
good point. The intention there, this is where this goes back to the national self-defense issue, right? So you can defend your country against invasion, against incursion by another state, by another country. That doesn't mean you have to stop at the borders of your country, right? You can keep repelling that enemy back until as far as it's necessary to repel that invasion, to stop that invasion.
But a point on that is, and I'm not saying I agree with this, but to look at it from another perspective, the Russian forces, and Putin, he would say, yes, but the relative of this is that there was this incursion, this invasion of NATO creeping, and therefore the invasion is then justified and not illegal, because they see what we are saying has happened in Kursk. If it's in defense of Ukraine, there has been a cross-border operation in defense. He would say, well, this has been in defense of this moving across here, therefore our crossing was justified. I know we get into a lot of blurry fog of war points in this, but then you can go back into the legitimacy of government, the legitimacy of these units, and serving within these units. And it gets very, very blurry.
Well, let's go back to the UN Charter for a start. It's without going into the provisions of the UN Charter. Ukraine is a sovereign state, and it's had various iterations over the years, as we know, but it is a sovereign state now, universally recognised as a sovereign state. It meets all the criteria of statehood. So incursion into that sovereign state is, well, it's a violation of the UN Charter, and it's therefore subject to self-defense. So national self-defense against the incursion. So that's the starting point. If it wasn't a defined state, so if it wasn't firstly recognised, doesn't need to be recognised, but that's a good starting point, right? It recognised by the majority of the world community, had defined boundaries, had boundaries that they can enforce themselves, had certain government structures, and could have the ability to do business with other states. So it meets the statehood criteria. Tick, tick, tick. There's others too, right? But tick, tick, tick. It's a state. So an incursion is a breach of the UN Charter. The Ukrainians crossing into Russia, so Kursk, just goes back to that self-defense point. They weren't crossing with the intent of invading at first instance. This is part of the self-defense where, as I say, you don't have to defend your country up to your own borders. You can press them back the other side, and it's convenient that this happens to be a conflict on a border, so it's state on state with a defined border, right? You can press them back as far as you need to stop that threat of invasion or that invasion. Now, they've gone into Kursk, and this Ukraine's gone into Kursk. Nothing wrong with that. There's still a Russian aggressor, and it's the conflict is still happening in Ukraine.
Yes. So you're saying that if these guys were killed, captured, wounded in here, it would be seen by the law similarly to as if they were on the occupied territories of Ukraine.
Yep, absolutely right. And then they should be treated exactly, and they should be treated as PWs because it's still international armed conflict, and they're members of an armed force. They meet all the non-mercenary tests, right? Yeah. So absolutely. Yeah.
What about those initial incursions in? So forget Kursk. Remember back to Belgrade when we saw the Russian volunteer, what the RVC or whatever it was called, those units who were run by a guy banned out of the EU because of neo-Nazi factions. It was seen as in line with the AFU, but not an AFU. They're very quick to point this out, and there was foreigners serving within that as well. How would that be seen as an incursion? It was a group which was told for informational war that it was made up of Russian forces, but we saw Poles and other foreigners, and everyone spoke Ukrainian other than the people that spoke English or Polish. How would that then be seen? I know we're well beyond that point in time, if that did occur then.
Yeah, let me just, I only half answered the previous question too. The argument that NATO was beginning to infringe on Russia's security doesn't justify the Russian invasion, because again, we have a state, a sovereign state, which may or may not join NATO, and even if it did join a regional security arrangement, Russia can say yes, there's some sort of perceived threat there because it's in a regional security arrangement. But where is the defined threat? Where is that? The fact that they're in an arrangement, where's that threat? So it's just too remote to be able to justify any sort of invasion on that basis. The same as other non-NATO countries in that part of the world are now joining or looking at joining NATO, and they're joining as a result of the Russian aggression. That's no secret, because they want to.
Oh no, sorry, you go. I don't want to cut you off.
That's right. So it's no secret they want to have that collective security which NATO NATO provides or should provide. So they've seen that being a part of that security arrangement is beneficial to their country. The same as Ukraine did and still does, because Ukraine has been pressing for NATO membership. As for the second question, so these groups. Now, these are the Russian groups, presumably you're talking about. Sorry, I've sort of lost the facts a bit.
Yeah, they referred to themselves as like the Freedom of Russian Legion. There was a couple of different ones working in here, headed up by a bloke we don't hear about anymore, but he was like banned from the EU for neo-Nazi groups and symbology and whatever, moved in. This was claimed to be not part of the AFU. It was a claimed predominantly Russian unit trying to free Russia from coming into areas like Belgrade. From the footage we saw, there was a number of Ukrainian speakers and a number of Polish and English speakers as well. Just as a test case, if one of them was captured at that point, how would that be seen?
So sorry, they're captured by Russia.
Russian forces. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. Well, again, this goes back to the mercenary issue, and it's a good little test case. Actually, it takes a bit of thinking, right? I think if we go back to first principles and look at Article 47 of Protocol 1, we have a look at the test. If Ukraine has said they're not part of the AFU, that's a bit of a problem for them, right? If Ukraine has expressly said these aren't part of us, well, these ticks, sorry, these points, the indicia of being a mercenary, one very clear indicia is not a member of the armed forces of a party to the conflict. But then we have a look at them. These are all cumulative. Okay, so we can have a look at the rest and then go, okay, it's a bit of a problem. Not a member of the armed forces of in this case, Ukraine. Has not been sent by a state. So did some other state send them, a non-party state to the conflict, to assist Ukraine? Official duty? Well, presumably no. What's their motivation for going in? Again, I think they say that their motivation was to help Ukraine, and they made. I think you said I'm aware of who you're talking about. These neo-Nazi type sympathies, etc. But they've expressed their motivation as helping Ukraine against the aggressor.
Well, a lot of their motivation was to overthrow the Russian government too, to rally support there and overthrow, which is, from my memory of this conversation, part of one of the requirements as well.
Yeah. Well, see, that takes it one step further, I guess. But at the moment, look, I think it turns on the fact, like I said, it's cumulative, but there is an issue of them not being a member of the armed forces of Ukraine. That's one indicia which would go against them. But the rest, look, I think it would be a decent argument, but I think it would be an argument in their favour, unless they're in there getting this material compensation, which is substantially more than what Ukrainian forces are getting. Now, I don't know who was paying them, presumably not Ukraine. And if it wasn't Ukraine and they were getting a lot of money for going in there, then are we now talking about the mercenary test?
Yeah, we did see supply of vehicles, both Soviet and Western vehicles. And, well, to be fair, it's probably some three-letter agency somewhere with the funding coming through. No one's doing nothing for anything.
I
just thought it'd be an interesting test case. But another test,
it's a great test case.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind researching it. Sorry.
Yeah, another one I want to put forward, and I'll send you some information on these guys.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Put forward is we speak about the legitimacy and legality of Russia's invasion into Ukraine, crossing that border for if we go on, because the idea of Ukraine joining NATO, territorial ambition, I put as a second, third, or fourth area in this. It's trying to the single constant here has been to deter Ukraine from joining NATO, whether Ukraine stick up its hands and goes, we won't join NATO, or push Ukraine into that much of an attritional war for and machine building infrastructure, everything that will never then meet the requirements to join, or the threat is too large. But as a test case here, if Mexico put up, we want to have a military alliance with China and America cross that border, would that be illegal as well?
Yes, because Mexico is a sovereign state. It meets all the ticks of statehood, and it's exactly the same. And this has just come up in discussion, in fact, with some of our neighbours in the Pacific, the Solomons and others, talking about getting into a strategic relationship with China, and the Solomons is a big one. So we then sent, Penny Wong and others, our various ministers off to start doing their diplomatic thing with the government of the Solomons. But if they had entered into that arrangement with China, this strategic arrangement, this self-defense arrangement, and we then rolled in there militarily, that would be a breach of the Solomons' state sovereignty. So because there's no war. We know there's a threat, but there's no war with China at the moment. There's no basis for us to, simply as a result of that relationship, no basis for us to roll in militarily. Same as the US. There would be no basis for the US to roll over the border into Mexico if they signed up to into a relationship with China. Have a look at the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which on its face, it's an economic initiative which benefits China substantially, but it's also purportedly to the benefit of other states who are involved in this Belt and Road. A lot of warning bells. A lot of states have had these big warning bells about that too. But what are you going to do about it? You know, if they're entering into a legitimate business relationship, and which is what it on its face it is, what can you say? Is it posing an immediate strategic threat? An immediate strategic threat. In other words, is that initiative about to become an invasion or some sort of hostile activity towards your country? And the answer is clearly no. Yeah.
What would you make of China then with sanctions against them for supplying military, or not even military aid, with civilian companies that may make drone parts that are then sanctioned, using then economic sanctions as a weapon or tool of warfare against private companies that may, Russia may be buying these parts, but you've sanctioned it at the base. What do you make of that? I know that's probably a very in-depth question, but just like a didn't read.
Well, I've done a bit of work lately on ITAR, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. And as you're aware, I've been involved in the case involving some allegations under ITAR, and some of the advice work I'm doing for one of these firms, one of these offshore firms, is regarding ITAR and regarding drones. It is really complicated, and it's sort of stepping into an area I was saying to step into the sanctions space. But look, if they're relying on ITAR and look at that, I think it's very hard for them to, because if there's Chinese equipment if it's going into a country where there are Russia, for example, there are sanctions, and the world community has said, no, if you give stuff to Russia, you're breaching these sanctions, then there's a problem, right? There's I think that's what they rely on. But if let's go back to your Mexico example, which I think is a very good example. There's no conflict between China and the US. There's no conflict between Mexico and the US. China enters into the strategic relationship. This is the scenario. This relationship with China. China starts sending them drone parts and all this sort of stuff. Well, does that alone pose a threat to the US? Well, no. There's no immediate threat. This is applying some of the tests I won't get into, but is there an immediate threat? No. If they start trafficking, if they're bringing in, if they start bringing in weapons, the Cuban Missile Crisis is a classic, right? Weapons which could be geared up immediately for offensive action against the United States, then there's a problem. Does that justify?
But adding that same thing, if you're bringing in weapons that could be used immediately against your country, what then if we switch it on its head, we switch it on its head and go, but is NATO encroaching on the border further eastwards? Could the Kremlin say, but you are bringing in weapons that could be used immediately against our area, that our security is not being seen to, therefore we have to cross a border to then do this? Now, I'm not saying I agree with that, but that is the argument that would go back. By Ukraine joining NATO, America will put outpost military bases here, because NATO is just a long arm of the US at the end of the day. There will be weapons, training, everything brought into the country that could have intent here. The intent is subjective. The intent of NATO is not going to fire that across, but it's subjective. The Russians may go, but if you have a missile that can fire 500 kilometers in Ukraine and it can hit Moscow, we don't care about what you think your intent is. That can change. How is there a differential there, or is it because it's a different flag where we see this?
Well, look at the threat equals capability plus intent. Oh, that's the formula. Bringing in equipment, capability, yes. Intent is the issue here. Now, this is a real facts-based scenario, and this is what they'd be looking at. They're looking at the factual circumstances here. Yes, NATO rolling in equipment. Yes, capability, bringing their own capability in or providing Ukraine capability. But where's the intent? And how could Russia prove the intent? The intent of threat towards them, not the intent of self-defense, which is what a defensive security arrangement is, but an offensive threat of some nature against Russia. How do they prove that on those facts particularly? If it got to the stage, and this Cuban Missile Crisis got to the stage where all of a sudden this equipment, this capability is there, which can very, very readily, well, firstly, why would the reason for putting the capability there? Cuban Missile Crisis. What was the reasoning? You can draw an inference as to intent in that. What was the reason? Why did the Russians put these very capable weapons, this very vigorous capability in Cuba? What was the intent?
Time on time. Yeah,
that's right. You start drawing inferences. So it's the same thing here. What's the capability, and what can be the, at the end of the day, the circumstantial case thing, right? Prima facie case is one of the inferences to be drawn, posing a threat, right? Then to prove it beyond reasonable doubt is the only inference to be drawn, the posing of a threat. If you can still argue, if you can still show a good reason for self-defense, this is me applying a bit of domestic law to it, right? But if you can still apply that self-defense statement, and the facts tend to support that, then it's very hard for the other side, for Russia in this case, to say, no, that's the capability, tick, and their intent is to threaten us. That's problematic. Now, there is case law on this, where it's been found that yes, there was a threat posed, and the response was justified. The UN Charter is very clear on this, though, too. The self-defense is quite limiting in the UN Charter. Like you can exercise this right of self-defense, this immediate right of self-defense, until the UN Security Council has become involved in the issue, in the matter. Right now, if Russia would then have to argue, they'd have to say yes, we're exercising self-defense against this capability and intent, and we have to report that exercise of self-defense to the Security Council. And if the Security Council still did nothing, and Russia still maintained its view that capability and intent were there, such that the threat existed, then they'd have to prove that and stand by that. And it's on the facts you gave me, it's problematic as compared to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which it's not.
Yeah, because someone sitting here, and to be devil's advocate, there would be, there was remaining Russian naval bases in Crimea pre-2014, as Ukraine was then looking to become a NATO state previously to that. You could see that, there's going to be weapon systems or bases brought in, that the ability, maybe not intent, but the ability to then have offensive capability out of those will definitely be there. It becomes a very hard case of, but the subjective to how Brussels may see it may be significantly different to how Russia may see it. And the Russian side of this will say, we brought up time and time again about our security concerns. No one saw to these. No one would even call us back on this security concern. So we couldn't voice it when we wanted to, and therefore this has happened. And what we do know is that there is a different standard applied across different nations, of which have more power within the UN. And we see this with the ICC. There's no better example with the ICC of the warrant put out for Mr. Netanyahu and the warrant put out for Putin, and the support of this, the legitimacy of this. So I don't want to get stuck in the weeds here, but it does seem that the UN Charter is applied in some cases and is not seen in other cases. I guess we could talk, I don't want to get into the weeds here, but I guess you could talk about Iraq and say, where was the rock solid hard evidence that this posed direct threat to the US? Where was that?
I have a certain view about the warrant, the ICC warrants. As you know, my PhD was on Rome Statute, so on command responsibility for war crimes. I put together a fairly big brief an advisory brief for certain clients. So I have a pretty solid view on the warrants, the ICC warrants regarding Netanyahu and defense minister, former defense minister, and the Putin warrants. I won't get into that sort of detail now because it's contentious and we'll probably end up having a blue over it. But
conversation for another day.
But look, you're right, and the fact that we have a Security Council with some very powerful players on there who veto as a matter of practice almost, and we see it every time. You're right. There is no equality, for want of a better word, in the UN in that regards. But look, I think the more relevant, more pertinent point here, I think, is you touched on it very well, is the fact that there was communication. If a state is communicating its concerns to the UN repeatedly, and they're getting no response, or the UN is they're not responding, that's a problem for a start, right? But if it's being fobbed off, if the UN are saying, well, look, we take note, the terminology they use, we take note of what you're saying, blah, blah, but affirm this. Then look, there are concerns, but does that lack of response then justify, does that overcome the requirement of capability plus intent to pose that threat? I think that still is going to be, still going to need to prove that threat, regardless of the protestation you've had in the circumstance. And we know there were military bases, Russian military bases, well, there certainly still are, even if they've moved the fleet around, there are still bases, right, in Crimea and elsewhere. Having said that, Ukraine have never ceded Crimea to Russia, and that's a whole other matter, of course. But look, at the end of the day, you still need that threat scenario. You still need to be able to and look, Russia's one of the big players in the Security Council. So, it has the power of veto. So it knows fully well how much it can use its power in the Security Council, right? And it knows that that the Security Council aren't going to, Russia is not going to agree with resolutions which directly affect it. So that comes into play too. But look, I take your point, and it's well made. I just think they still need to justify that, in this case law, justify that imminent threat.
Yeah. What do you make on that same case of Israel's move across into Syria when we saw the Assad regime fall? Mate, what do you make of that movement across the border there? Could Israel say that there was an imminent threat to their state there from Syria?
Yeah, look, that buffer zone, for a start, it was a UN sanctioned buffer zone. The Golan Heights obviously are a very critically strategic point for Israel. Now, we had the Assad regime that was always obviously anti-Israel. It always posed a threat to Israel, and indeed, as you know, Syria was one of the two parties that decided to roll into Israel in the 7-Day War. So there's always been a threat there posed by Syria. There's a new regime overthrows Assad. Now, we don't know. Look, I'm not trying to justify Israel. I'm sort of giving you the facts as I see them.
Yeah.
We have a regime which comes in, which is headed by the head of a declared terrorist organization, declared by many countries. We've listed them, and a head of that organization who now is saying he wants to have a peaceful democracy, etc. in Syria, but previously was very anti-Israel, adopted that whole approach, and it was openly Islamist. So you can sort of see Israel's point here where, okay, we've got this, we had the buffer, we knew the threat, we were containing the threat. Now we have that threat's gone. Now we have this new threat. Is now the opportune time to start to remove some of that capability. Now, there has been some pressure from certain, the UN haven't sanctioned that. There's been no Security Council, well, there wouldn't be because the US wouldn't vote, right? There's been no Security Council resolution condemning that. There's been countries saying they shouldn't be doing it. But I think at the end of the day, again, it goes back to capability and intent. In this case, the intent, can you infer it from the previous actions of that group and the previous words and actions of that leader? Well, Israel would say yes, and the capability is still there. Yeah.
You're saying this, though, that there is a declared terrorist group then moving through there, which is a declared group. What then do you make of, we do know that there was Ukrainian drone operators then working within this group to, increase the level of drone competency, and of course a NATO member Turkey working here as well. What do you make of that?
With the Assad regime or with this terrorist group?
With terrorist group.
Yeah. Okay. Look, I think, well, a lot of Hezbollah is a declared group. Hamas is a declared group. Iran, obviously, they are Iran's proxies in the region. Like that, yes. Hezbollah is Iran's military force in the north. Well, it certainly was. Yes. So yes, they're going to fund. They're going to sponsor, support any group that's going to have a crack at Israel. Right now, and so that sort of bolsters my argument a bit too, because if there's Ukrainian support of this, if there's Iranian support of this group, we know Iran's declared threat to Israel. So does that bolster the threat that Israel would perceive? Well, yes. I didn't know there was Russian drone people in there, because I know the Russians were involved in the Assad regime. So that's very interesting to hear.
Yeah, no. So we
Yeah.
definitely know that there is. So more what I'm getting at is with the Assad regime, back through Iran and Russian support, and then we see with the SDF overthrow and everything that occurred in there as well. We saw then, of course, Turkey fighter jets dropping bombs in support of this, and we also then see, at least claim to my knowledge, fairly beyond doubt, that there was Ukrainian drone operators operating within these SDF style units, some of these other units, to support in the overthrow of the Assad regime in a hybrid warfare, because Iran and Russia both have tied up in that as well. What do you make of this? Because it's a difficult situation in this of what constitutes legitimate governance, sovereign borders, and backing militant groups within this, some of which are declared.
Look, I'd have to. Well, on its face, it's a problem, because this is a declared terrorist. The UN has looked at this, and there's UN terrorist organization conventions, treaties around, but all these member states have said, yes, we've declared this a terrorist organization. So, look, there are problems there. I'd have to have a look at the facts a bit more. It's all facts based, but the law itself, I think, poses a bit of a problem there, because is it state support of a terrorist organization? Is it like state sponsorship of that? Does it cross into state sponsorship of that terrorist organization? Where's that line in the sand? It's an interesting sort of facts.
Yeah, well, we see that with Turkey, NATO member, dropping bombs in here in support of this, and Turkey's thing is, we can basically switch on and off NATO membership, and I go, you can't in my opinion, it's like you can't do, and even if you think you can do that, other countries in the world are not going to see to that as legitimate, because then if a bomb gets fired from Syria into Istanbul, you can't go, well, you weren't a member state of that. I'm sure as hell know that we're going to be enact Article 5 one way, but not another. It gets messy. It gets into this point where people see that it's only problematic if it's not the US or NATO doing it. And people will look at, and I know your time in all of this is much more than mine. Do you see that a lot of countries around the world are looking and going, there tends to seem to be a hypocrisy if it's not the US-led rules-based order here? Can you? And I'm not saying I'm against that, but I'm saying, can you see from another perspective that people see that is? It's like, it's fine here. Iraq would be fine. If China moved into Mexico, I guarantee the US would cross the border, and it would then be seen as a justifiable X, Y, and Z. And there tends to be, and I think this is pushing many nations to go, well, we actually would rather be part of this or that, and lowering global dominance here. Not getting into something completely
Look, I think, well, you know as well as I do that the military appreciation process, we then put ourselves into the minds of the we red team, put ourselves into the mind of the other side, and what are their courses likely and most dangerous courses of action. So yes, we should be keeping our open mind rather to what the perception is. And look, I think you're right. I think there is a broad perception that this US hegemony and indeed the security, the power in the Security Council in the permanent members, that it is like a dominant feature. But the Security Council is a bit of a bad example because it's quite polarized now, obviously. But look, I think there's a lot of people. Again, I think this is getting into that political space, but a lot of people would say, well, yes, that's the US's idea of the world order, the international legal order, right? And they're the hegemon for the moment. China would have a different view, and people might say, well, look, I prefer their view. So it's certainly look, your point's spot on. Like we should be thinking what other people think, and indeed, we should be thinking what these we know what these Islamist states think because they say it quite openly. And when they discuss their thoughts and their public statements about how they would propose to change the international legal order by destroying an entire state and driving its people into the ocean, or flying aircraft into major cities, that's a bit of a problem. Right? That's taking changing the international legal order a little bit too far. But look, I take your point. Yes, We should be thinking about what others. I might just raise one quick thing too. We didn't quite finish off on the earlier piece about the foreign fighters legislation.
Yeah, I'd love. Yeah, sorry,
I saw your flag in the background.
The weeds somewhere.
Yeah. No, but they're great discussions, and I really liked them. And you've opened up a couple of research ideas for me. If I was still teaching at uni, I'd give it to some postgrad students. But I saw the flag behind you, and you reminded me about the legislation, right? Most of the as you're aware, most of the people that I work with in Ukraine and still advise now, well, in fact, all of them are ex-military, but the majority are Australian, ex-ADF. And the people I've been speaking to during the Oscar Jenkins situation of an evening, I'm talking to Australians in the Legion, very reliable, former, seen quite experienced, specialised Australians. Right? For Australians to go to somewhere like Ukraine or anywhere to fight, it's become a bit of an issue. This was a knee-jerk reaction, I think, by our government to the Dan Duggan case. And you know that I'm involved in the Dan Duggan case, the former US Marine fighter pilot who the US have alleged was training Chinese, etc. And they're trying to extradite him, and he's been locked up for 2.5 years. Full disclosure, he's a mate, his family are mates, and I'm a part of the legal team, so I won't talk about that anymore. But that's where this legislation, suddenly our government said, look, we need to tighten this up, right? So they introduced, I'm going to read it again, the Defence Amendment Safeguarding Australia's Military Secrets Act of 2024, the SAMS Act. Right now, this is where I started. They've made it complicated because they won't make anything simple. But to break it down to its bare bones, if you were ever in defence, so the ADF or Defence Public Service, it's the presumption is, so this is an irrebuttable presumption, this is it, that you have sensitive defence knowledge, right? So therefore, this attempts to prevent or control, us training or working for some foreign countries and military organisations, right? So some foreign countries or military organisations is important. There are a list, and they call them relevant foreign countries. Now, you can't go into the Act and find a list of the relevant forein countries. We don't sit out there and go, oh, well, okay, here's the list, China. Yeah, if you're going to go work for China, they're the baddies. It doesn't say that. And it's never going to say that, right? But what it does, it's a negative. What it does have is non-relevant nations. So if you're going to go work for either train or work for the government, it's the Five Eyes, right? Canada, New Zealand, USA, or UK.
Okay.
They're non-relevant nations. You don't need to be going through this. Anyone else, you need to be putting in these requests to our government, because you're considered you need a foreign work authorization. So you're a person who needs a foreign work authorization. You have to then apply for that. Now, essentially, anywhere other than those countries, you've got to put this authorization in.
Right.
It then doesn't list. Well, Ukraine is one that you can go to because it's not tucked away somewhere, one of these countries where the government said no, you can't go to.
Didn't it only tell you what countries you can go to?
That's
so
right.
Wouldn't we assume every other one you can't go to?
Yeah, that's exactly
Ukraine?
right. That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. It's right. So it's by a matter of exclusion, and that's not in the legislation. That's in a directive from the minister. So
they are breaking the SAMS Act by training or participating in Ukraine if they are. So Mr. Jenkins in this case is not, because he was not a former Australian soldier, but the former Australian soldiers, of which there are many participating in Ukraine, both in training, in medical, in the war. If they do not have that signed off, they are against that act.
Well, that was the advice I gave. Because a lot of these guys some of these guys, in fact, one of the guys that I'm in communication with a lot now was there since Hostomel. He fought at Hostomel. So, the first major battle, really, pushing the Russians back. This legislation came into effect in 2024. In fact, 6th of May, 2024. So after tanks rolled over the border, right? So at the time there was no requirement for any authorization. He has stayed there. He's come home on leave once. Did the requirement then kick in for him to get an authorization? Yes, it did. Right? And then
but that obviously hasn't been enforced, because no one I know there has ever signed off on that.
Yeah, well, see, that's a thing. While I was there, I made a point of them all doing it.
Right. Did anyone do it? Yeah. All my boys there are like, we're not fucking doing it.
Yeah. No, the guys I was working with. And so we and particularly if they're coming home and then going back. I know there's a couple of guys have been picked up at the airport and spoken to coming back in through Sydney, Sydney in this case, right? And including this guy who I advised to get his authorization, his request in before he went back, which he did while he was on leave, right? So look, it's pretty. I suspect they're pretty strict about it because that Dan Duggan scenario, I think, has bitten our government in the arse a bit. And I think they're playing catch up in a big way, and it's complicated, but it's quite easily you get around it quite easily. If you go into a country that is not bad guys, if you're going to Ukraine, if you're going to a country which our government doesn't perceive our government doesn't perceive to be the baddies.
That's the point, because you could go to Iraq or Syria, and people will see one group as bad guys, one group as good guys, clear as day. The government may not, and it'd be hang on, like if you live in, if you are a Palestinian Australian, you will see a bad and a good guy significantly different for what the government then may see. So the subjectivity is very difficult. And my advice has been to these guys, to my guys, I know this isn't legal advice, but is be careful of who you work for, because nothing is forever and governments can change, and it can go, 20 years ago, didn't you work for that group that then blew up that bridge? Weren't you training in that? I'll just take something out of that too. And this is a really good discussion. This is so relevant and really quite so pertinent to us. General Hindmarsh in the UAE. This is well before SAMS went over there. UAE is not the Australian government would not consider UAE to be an adverse country, or whatever terminology they want to use. General Hindmarsh goes over there. There's some issues raised, so he ends up joining their military. He wears a uniform of one of their generals. But he gets a lot of Australians, former serving special operations mostly. Yeah, I know the boys. They made a fucking heap of money.
Yeah, that's right. They do get a lot. In fact, I was talking to somebody today who told me how much they do get.
Yeah.
It's insane, right?
Yeah, tax-free oil money, baby.
Yeah. But they're in training roles, right? So, I think the undertaking would be that they're just, I don't know what they're doing, but the undertaking is just in training roles, getting paid a lot of money. They would all be applying for these foreign work authorizations. They would have to, because that's not one of the non-relevant countries.
Yes.
Right. And you have to have a look at the list, and then you put it in, then the government goes, yep, that country's fine. Right. If tomorrow UAE suddenly became, like, again, in the view of our government, I think it's pretty straightforward, right? But that's a pretty easy test to keep yourself out of jail, because they're going to enforce it in a big way, because we're seeing it now with Dan Duggan, and as much as the government's done the wrong thing here, and as has the US, and I won't get into too much detail, but it's the very fact they brought in this legislation in such a rapid, almost guillotined it through, tells me that they're just trying to fill some holes, right?
Yeah, well, those guys who have held security clearances from, sensitive all the way to top secret, who then get out and go, well, I can earn double the money and go and work for, and you and I would know a lot of these companies, that these are just private contracting companies driving around VIPs. But then you'd never know where the blurry line gets on this. And that's, I think, the US, the biggest thing that's going to break in the US, and I think this is going to break in a big way, is some of these ex-service members getting picked up to train in cartels. Now that's something, that's a story for another time, and something I'm working on in the background. But one of the big things I've been telling guys, if you're going to do this, do it so it's kosher, and do it to try and future-proof yourself from this. Because if you join the UAF, the Ukrainian Armed Forces, I get you pretty good fucking odds in 50 years' time. The Britain has just signed a 100-year deal. Pretty good odds that within your lifetime, there's not going to be, we see this as an enemy nation. Okay, but some of these other groups that may be operating here, if you join up the Freedom of Russian Legion, whatever they'll call themselves, that I don't know, because there is, they're fighting against a country to want to overthrow someone that sits on the Security Council. We're probably heading towards a negotiated process. Be very, very careful. What do you make? Does it make any difference of guys that have gone on leave without pay who are still employees of the Defence Force at the time?
That's a whole other. It's another good issue, because it happens. I know of people who have left the permanent military, special operations guys, gone into the reserve. So, the legislation there that when you're not in service, when you're not in uniform parading, blah blah. leave without pay is still in service.
Yeah.
Now there's a problem because it wasn't that long. Well, we still had to put in applications to go overseas on leave, whether you're on whether you're in service or on leave without pay, because you're still in service. Right? Reservists, even for a while, their reservists had to. Like when Indonesia, suddenly the threat level went up in Indonesia, and I was in the reserve at this stage, and I had to put a request in to go to Bali, and it was knocked back as a reservist.
Well, drink beers on the beach, mate.
But people did go. In fact, there was an officer, I think it was a naval officer or somebody, went, and he got done, right? Because so look, it is, yeah, that would be very hard for somebody on leave without pay to do it. Well, firstly, if they put in their request, it would be knocked back. They didn't put in their request; they're in the frame.
You're right, because there are a number of gentlemen who have gone on leave without pay to go and serve in Ukraine. And one of my bits of advice to them was, if you were to get caught or killed by the Russian forces, they will see you, and tell me if I'm wrong here, as rightfully a current serving member of a foreign fighting force currently fighting for a foreign nation.
Yeah.
Which causes a whole bunch of, I know there's nuance added. It's not like they're parading every morning and you're deployed by your chain of command. I know that is the nuance, but do you think that the Kremlin is going to add that nuance? Do you think that the Brussels or whoever is going to add the nuance to guys signing up to fight in Wagner PMC or the North Korean units or X, Y, and Z?
That's right.
There's my advice has been protect yourself before anyone else boys.
You're right, and the Russians are going to go, this is Australian boots on the ground fighting for Ukraine. That's how they're going to see it, right? And our government's going to be embarrassed, and they're going to go, that's a big nightmare, including for the guy on leave without pay, right? It is an Australian defense. Now, how that, as you know, there's a filtration process, and probably wasn't early on, but there's a filtration process now where if you're ex-military, Ukrainian recruiters want to see evidence of that. And if you haven't got something, if something that says you're not ex, but you're serving, hopefully they're going to say there's a problem here, right? Okay. Hopefully, right? You shouldn't be asked, well, not you, but the person shouldn't be asking anyway, but hopefully they'll pick that up. And I know they were pretty strict with one of the team houses I was living in. These guys were specialists, and they were very strict with looking at their qualifications, their background, etc. And one of those things, when they were, if they picked up current serving, I'm sure that would have been a stoppage, because they were so strict with the rest of their qualifications, right? Somebody who's perhaps not in a specialist role, who, say somebody's come from an infantry battalion, just a rifleman. I say just a rifleman. The average infantry rifleman is a highly trained asset, right? But nonetheless, a rifleman, are they going to be that strict? Well, yes, they're going to want to see that you actually were a rifleman and you were trained and you were in the ADF. Because if you say you're a civilian, and then they're going to accept, they're going to have a look at you and see whether you can do the job, right? Now, previously, but now. But if you say you're ex-military, then they're going to want to see proof of that, and they do want to see proof of that. But they're not going to be they're not going to be so critical looking through the thing. But if you have these roles where you're purporting to fill these specialist roles, which, as you know, the Legion members in some of these GUR units, they have quite specialist capabilities. They're looking at all those things.
Yeah, but that's where I guess that SAMS comes into it. About sensitive training and information well, there are capabilities in Australia that we want to remain, or some of it we want to remain in Australia, and other of it we don't want to leave Five Eyes. And without permission, going across and teaching a foreign nation, of which is not NATO, not EU, not Five Eyes, some of these things. Now, at this point in time, I'm not saying it's a problem, but I'm saying if I was at the legislature, that is a problem, because that is a tactical, X battalion or brigade, whatever we have, that could be used in any other capacity after this. That's the whole point of the SAMS, which is just at this point, you're more in the know than I, but it seems like it's not being really taken seriously. And there is, there is concern for other nations and where this goes after it, because after this war, there's going to be 1 million people looking for jobs all around. If there is, imagine if there's an Australian foreigner, not SAMS approved, has trained a Ukrainian unit to do this, great. Then after this war, there's going to be 1 million guys who want to go and fight a war, who are trained killers who want to go and fight. Money on the private theatre. then this training rolls out, and next thing it's rolling into other theatres around the world, enabled by, you know, the butterfly effect backwards. We end up, it can end up. I know we're adding a lot here, but it can end up an absolute nightmare. Something else I wanted to.
Sorry, just quickly. I was going to build on that because I think it's a point we probably shouldn't go over too quickly. EW bears, right? Major asset to us. Very highly cleared, obviously, and compartmented for obvious reasons. They get out. They want to get jobs. They have skills. They want to be able to then use. Some of them come into the army with no skills. They're given this skill. They want to use it. Like you shouldn't be saying no to somebody. No, you've got to go and work at McDonald's because the amazing skills we've given you, we don't want you using them.
It's worth adding. Australia is a world leader in electronic warfare and countermeasures too.
There we go. And that's right. And we saw it in Afghanistan, right? Yeah, we've seen it, and they're popular. They're popular, right? How much of their stuff is going to be TTPs? How much are they going to be if they go overseas to work for even a private company, like companies that are developing equipment to fill those roles, and they want people to go in there and advise on it or help test it or whatever? How much Australian TTP is going into that? Well, I would suggest a lot.
Yeah.
Right. How much of that is open source? I would suggest not much at all. And when they're applying this SAM stuff, are they not just looking at the country? Are they looking at the person and what they could potentially be taking? So, you know, it's how deep is this going?
Yeah. Well, this is the thing. This is one of these things. It's like, you know, if there's training, there's TTPs given here, and then we have a Nord Stream Mark II accident happen, could there be, you know, go back and go, well, who the fuck was doing this, blah, 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 all the way back? And to say that we will, into the next century, still claim you know, Western global hegemony, we can't rely on that either. It's a very interesting bit. One more thing I saw that a lot of Russian pages pushed on, and it's always hard to know where there is just someone who is on the pro-Russian side and when it is Russian media. That's a very, very hard line to try and stick between. And Mr. Boykov, who I really do thank him for actually getting back to us on this response quickly. That was great. Because otherwise this wouldn't have had the, you know, both sides of it. Is there was, not from himself but from other pages, saying that Mr. Jenkins could have been seen as a spy due to his time in China for almost the decade previously to this. On a situation like that, have you had any? Have you seen anything around this as well? And could the treatment of a prisoner of war there be seen differently if there was anything like that? And maybe not himself, but if it was seen to be someone of espionage.
Look, espionage brings in a different set of circumstances, and I think in this case, I haven't seen anything about. I knew he was in China, but I've seen nothing beyond that. There's going to be media chatter, as there always is. You know, one of my guys, in fact,
theories everywhere. More is just a test case. If we just forget him out of this, if there was seen to be,
Look, I guess it comes down to the weight of evidence they had. They could accuse anybody of espionage, but as we've seen certain countries do, right? But I guess it comes down to the weight of evidence. But putting aside the weight of evidence for a moment, if that's the case, then it changes the circumstances somewhat. They're still entitled to protections, right? They're still entitled to even. Well, I would argue that it's very hard to say they're not entitled to PW protection because they're still, at the time they were captured, they were a serving member, etc. But if it's then proven that they were doing something other than what a serving member of the particular army does, then that changes the facts a bit. And look, the protections are still there, but whether they get the full protections as PW, I don't know. I think in this case, like I said, I haven't heard it, and I shouldn't be surprised that some of the chattering media have raised it, but it's like, anyway. Look, I think it's just something that wouldn't be factored into any of this.
No, I agree. It was more just if there was something. Is there any differences on the protections of a person participating in something like this? Because of course we know that this war is an informational war. It's a global war. Like there's everyone, every dick and his dog is in some way involved in this. From China to Russia to the US to everyone to us. That it's going to be the absolute epicenter of sabotage, of reconnaissance, of espionage, of everything from Russian spies kicking around to bloody thriller agencies from everywhere. It's worth kicking in, because we see all the time. We see the SBU arresting, suspected FSB or SVR agents. We see on Russia Today will say that they've captured SBU or whatever as well. And even if we take 50% of that as just propaganda, there's 50% that's not as well, and it's a factor that we need to be brought in. Do you see, as a law professional, do you see that the laws of armed conflict, POW status, and all of this is being applied differently towards Russia and Ukraine? Because there is blatant laws of armed conflict that have been breached, from execution by drone to horse the combat, all of this as well, that we have seen both sides being at guilt of through the chemical warfare conventions, the use of K-51s, all of this. Do you see that the major players in the UN or the West are applying this differently towards Russia than it is towards Ukraine? Because if you look at the chemical warfare convention, the use of chlorpyrifos, K-51s, there is clear, in my opinion, beyond reasonable doubt, evidence of this being used by both forces. Yes, you read on CWC, you read from the White House, whatever, it will only ever name Russia. We see the same for this. And there's clear other times when this has occurred. And you just log on Twitter and you'll see a video of a surrendering soldier be hit by a grenade. You and I discussed this on the last occasion, actually. I think it was you and I and Howie. Yeah, absolutely. And it was a great discussion. And in fact, we saw that we watched some of the footage, right? Although you edited some of the footage for obvious reasons, but I saw the real footage. And look, starting point is it must apply both ways, right? It must apply both ways. The next point is, if one side's not applying the law correctly, then the other side still must apply the law correctly, right? It doesn't excuse a change in behaviour. Whether we're seeing now, I know some of these cases have been investigated or are being investigated. Some of the Ukrainian cases, I don't know how many, but the handful that I've spoken about, they are. I can't tell you how many are and how many aren't. Whether the ones that we spoke about, and look, on its face, the drone ones, they were an issue. Right? There's a whole legal issue there with where does that responsibility lie. I think the fact that they're not fully autonomous, there's a more causal nexus back, a more responsibility nexus back to the operator. Well, we did say as well, because Ukraine does have the I Want to Live program and has had a case study of which you can surrender to a drone and leaflet drop, that therefore you have shown that this capability then does exist. Absolutely right. You have to do this. You can't say that it is then impossible to take a POW. Mate, that's exactly the point. Exactly. And there's a whole bunch of study there in the ability to surrender to a drone, right? But the Ukraine has proven that they can do it, because there's footage of Russians surrendering and following those instructions, right? So so state practice, again, that's very supportive of the fact that they know. So look, to answer your question, I don't know whether it's being applied differently, but it should be applied the same, right? It should be being applied the same. Well, I haven't sort of been looking into any detail on that. One point I will raise, though, is one of the things I was advising on while I was on the ground was advising some of these specialist Legion teams in prisoner handling, because they wanted to make sure that they were doing everything. They didn't want any possible allegation. They just wanted to be squared away, right? And a couple of these guys, they had a bit of rank when they were in their various militaries. Now, why would they do that? Why would they want to be seen and be able to say we got legal advice on this, and we did this and this? Why would they want to be able to say that? They have concerns that somebody down the track is going to say, well, Ukraine wasn't doing this, right? So therefore they can say, well, we were, right? If they ever guilt by association sort of stuff. So look, so we know it goes both ways. We know there's things happening on both sides, and we also know that, and one of my other roles was liaising with a member of the RADA and these Legion teams, because there was you may have seen this, made the media. There were some issues with some of the command structure. Some of the Ukrainian, they subsequently brought in, they changed that command structure, and it became very good. They had good liaison officers and good Ukrainian commanders who were fully aware of their obligations, right? But early on, look, there were certainly issues. We do see this, that the law, and in my opinion, I think it's objectively true that the media the conventions, the major players in this are applying the law one way and not the other. There's a very famous footage of the Russian soldiers out on the ground, then they get machine gunned down. Yes, there was an investigation, but the investigation started at perfidy. It didn't start at could it be an execution. So the internal investigation started at a point of which it shouldn't have. It should have started at what was everything in this, not was did someone try and run away. It didn't start properly, and it's been forgotten in the wind. And if
so we're looking at defences, defences first rather than looking at priests first.
And I say, like, if we want to, and this goes back to my idea of you know, maintaining global hegemony and not having this level of hypocrisy, if we are holding Russia, if we will say you need to uphold these laws of armed conflict and this and that, and we expect them to do, and we'd expect them to hand over or you know, make the correct legal processes of these who have not. And we know that just because Russia's not seeing to it does not mean that we are not. And a country of which we are allied with has, to my knowledge, not arrested a single person in any of this yet. You can see why countries, we might go the other way and go, well, why is anyone seeing to it? You're only applying it one way. People will point at Israel of this, people will point at other groups around that area. And there's a concern there that it's going, well, you end up just going to make this a free-for-all. That if you've ended up, these videos are being celebrated and shared, no investigation of a drone dropping on an 18-year-old Russian and blowing him up and he's there with his hands up, or machine gun everyone, what does that build? It systemically builds an environment of which then you end up with executions on the front line. Yevgeny Prigozhin saying, we will not take any POWs, we will shoot them because of this, or you end up with drone operators getting executed because they think they've seen footage of this operator doing this. My point is, if we're not willing to uphold it internally, and Ukraine is one of our allies, they are joining NATO, why should we expect then our adversary, in this case Russia or China or whoever, to uphold it? It's this weird mix. It seems like, and I see again and again, every time I look through other media, everyone just points at the hypocrisy here. And I go, I can agree on 50% of it, because it's like, yeah, that is a war crime. That has occurred. No one brings up anything about, like, Nord Stream, for example, overwhelming evidence out of Germany that it was a Ukrainian sabotage team did this. It hit through Poland back into Ukraine, can't get a warrant to bring these guys back. Ursula von der Leyen, all these people saying that it is an attack on EU energy infrastructure, the full force, this and that. It is an attack against that. Yes, it just seems like it's applied one area and not applied others.
Well, it goes to legitimacy. It goes to legitimacy. The law needs to be legitimate. Needs to be seen to be legitimate, and you're absolutely right. And look, I'm going to give you, short answer is I don't know, but I agree with you. I agree. If eventually it snowballs and then no one's applying it, right? But the example I've been looking at lately is when people are trying to, like certain groups are trying to shut down urban operations. Urban operations are becoming an increasingly prevalent aspect of military operations, right?
Yes.
They're trying to say that belligerents shouldn't be using weapons, explosive weapons with wide area effect. In other words, no mortars, no artillery, no air. They should just be sending in troops and doing ground maneuvers. You and I both know that poses a bigger risk to the civilian population. Having like it just does, right? We know that. We won't go into the detail. But if you're then saying taking away the commander's options, if you're saying we can no longer have this option, and this option, that leaves them with one option, then what's to stop the commander going, well, okay, I've got nothing to lose here. Go in and do what you have to do, right? The law actually says that the commander must look for, this is a targeting law issue, must use the most appropriate option, which will, reduce the anticipated expected collateral damage, etc. Right? And the other point was too, if they're imposing this standard, the standard at the moment is the reasonable commander. Essentially, the Rendulic case said that they don't second guess the commander. This is relevant to what you're saying. I'll make it more relevant in a second, right? But you can't second guess the commander. Commander makes these decisions and it's assessed at the time of the decision making, and they look at the reasonable commander in the position of that commander making that decision. If they change that standard and then start looking at the effects-based application and sort of we're seeing this now, increasingly more often ignoring when it's supposed to be at the decision-making end, then commanders it's going to actually have a worse effect on IHL, in fact, humanitarian law, because the commanders are going, well, this is my job. I can't achieve this by any, my hands are so tied now, and they're going to assess me on the effects anyway. just do it. IHL now means nothing. The
Yeah.
same goes for the scenario you raised. If we don't see everybody being held to account equally, then it loses its legitimacy, and then its IHL no longer applies, right? And you're spot on. And if the world community identifies a baddie and a goodie, and look, in this case, the Russian aggressor is the aggressor, right? In terms of that's the going to war part. That's the other part, right? But the part in war, so the application of IHL in war. So the reason for going to war is a different thing. Put that aside. The application in war is what we're talking about now. And look, yes, it doesn't matter who was the aggressor. That's irrelevant, right? It's now what the behavior is on the ground. And if they're both behaving badly, they both must be scrutinized and held to account equally.
So why then, with an ally of NATO and the West, why is there no account being held there?
Yeah, I don't know. Like I said, I don't know the facts on the ground. I know of a handful of cases that they are looking at, and because I confirmed it through my, but only a handful. So I haven't got an answer why, and I've seen that footage, and I don't know whether anybody in that was held to account, but quite presumably not.
Well, but it's the thing is, my point is, it's not a handful of cases. It's a bucket full of cases. It's a new footage every single day. Whether it be coming through, Russian pages of Russians committing it, of Ukrainians committing it, and I'm saying no, there's thousands of these cases. There are thousands of these cases. I understand that there are massive limitations around, a major nuclear power who is an adversary of us currently. That we can't go in and say, yep, Mr. fucking Ivan, we are arresting you and taking you to the Hague. But one of our allies, of which we are saying we have you are joining NATO, that we see as a de facto NATO member, we are not willing to hold to any account for these actions. I think, firstly, it just seems, from a law professional, it seems no one is willing, no one has the balls to do this, because the UN is so biased, heavily US oriented biased, and Western rules-based order, our world order, no one's willing to go against it, because next thing we're sanctioning you and you're not allowed to trade with us. The whole system is, I can see why many players, I can see why China's going, the hypocrisy you guys uphold, we don't want any part of it. And other nations going, let's join X, Y, or Z, and actually lowering our global dominance.
But I agree entirely with you. And like I say, the handful of cases I'm aware of that were, I'm not saying it's only a handful of cases. I know there's lots. We all know there's lots, right? And in fact, a couple of the legionnaires that I was advising early on from here, before I even went to Ukraine, raised issues with me, which I took up through various channels. And these are the cases I'm talking about that were investigated. And as you know, the SBU investigates the military and investigates legionnaires.
So it's an internal investigation, though.
That's right. No,
obviously, that's right. But this is then the problem, is if you have an internal investigation from a group which doesn't have the best track record with this, and a whole reason to have informational warfare. So if we said the FSB is then, for a case study, if we said the FSB is investigating this Russian soldier for then executing a Ukrainian soldier, every single person is going to go, you can't fucking do that. You're going to find them innocent. And what I say is, no, this is, the Ukrainian forces and the Ukrainian government is an extension of NATO. They are on a irreversible path to NATO membership that we need to be holding to account ourselves too. That if Germany committed a war crime, if modern Germany committed a war crime here, that the rest of the community should be going, you can't do that. The SBU, they know that if they find someone guilty, it's going to be a media fucking nightmare.
Oh, well, if they get a brief, you mean? But because, I guess the question is,
their domestic, their international aid.
So
there's an incentive not to find people guilty too, which is this is the job of then the Geneva Convention, the laws of armed conflict, the IHL, that no one seems to be doing anything about.
But I think the point you raised there is good. The jeopardizing international aid. Not so much the SBU like getting a prosecutor. Well, they don't. They just investigate. And you're quite right. And the same thing applies to Australia. There's been a lot of over many years, a lot of talk about us investigating ourselves. And there was big criticism of Brereton, even though he made certain adverse findings. How much are they going to get out of that? The OSI is a separate body, yes, but so look, and I'm not a big fan of the ICC now. I have to say, I think it's it's gone too political and off the rails. That's a whole other discussion we'll have later, I think. But look, mate, you're right. SBU, I think the proof of the pudding here is whether a brief's gone to the Prosecutor General and what the Prosecutor General's got. And if they get this brief and they look at it and they apply a proper prosecutorial test, I'm not saying ours is the be-all, end-all, but some sort of test which looks at the strength of the case and then make a decision whether they should be prosecuting. Like we apply the prima facie case, then are we going to get a conviction beyond reasonable doubt, and is it in the public interest? That's our test. They've got I know their legislation, and I've got their bench book, so it's a similar test, right? As long as they're applying that, and if the brief coming out of SBU is terrible, if they can see the holes, they should be trying to get those holes filled. That's not happening. That's a problem. And if the brief's not making its way to the Prosecutor General, that's a problem. So when I say that I'm aware of these handful of cases that were brought my way by Legionnaires, I don't know where they've gone beyond the SBU, right? So look, it's a very good point, and I absolutely agree with you. Yeah. And is the Prosecutor General going to be giving this? I'd like to say yes. I'm a former military prosecutor myself, as you know, and a former civil prosecutor, right? So I'd like to think that they're putting any sort of political issues aside and looking at these cases as they should be, but I don't know.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, even if we look, Australia, when we investigated, and there's holes in that, and we weren't in an existential war for the survival of the state.
That's right.
And our industrial, Australia has, its own military industrial complex that serves the Australian military. We're not an existential. So Ukraine's issue in this is they're in an existential war for their survival, in which that survival is based on foreign international military aid, which is based on how people see Ukraine to vote in democratic elections. All the incentive in the world is to not do this. So there is it seems like the law is only upheld if you're the lowest common denominator.
I'd like to see how that in other situations too. And look, mate, I agree with you. Right, and that's how it would appear to the reasonable, the objective person looking from the outside in. I'd like to look at other conflicts and see, like in the Balkans, was it applied similarly? I developed a subject, international criminal law, taught it to last year undergrads at Wollongong Uni, and I raised it. And down here, there's a lot of big Serbian community. I went through a lot of the case law, and I was talking about the ICTY cases, right? And the vast majority were Serb defendants. And a young Serbian Australian woman complained and said, he's racist. Everyone he was talking about were Serbs. It just happened that the case law issues we were discussing all involved Serbian defendants, right? But you look at it and then you go, well, was there something else in that conflict? Was there another influence in that conflict which swayed things one way or the other? Is the similar sort of scenario, I think. And I don't know.
Of course, and Israel's an example of this too, of where things are applied and not applied. For Biden to turn around and go with the warrant for Putin's arrest, this is legitimate. They have all the authority, blah blah blah, and it goes out for Netanyahu and go, well, that's not legitimate. They have got no authority, they've got no jurisdiction. And what I've said is, well, look, I'm not saying one way or the other has or not, but I'm saying that if you are willing to be part of this and that has found X and that has found Y, and you just because you disagree with one, I disagree that the road out the front should be 60 kilometres an hour. I think it should be 80 kilometres an hour because I can drive safely down there. But you have to sort of see to, well, outside of us has come to this, but the amount of pull and everything can be massive. But
having done a lot of work on the warrants piece, I'll agree with your point about that. It has to be the same. It has to be. All things must be equal. Yeah.
Like the investigation needs to be fair, and if finds X guilty and X innocent, right, we need to stick with that as well.
That's right.
And if it finds Putin, that he's guilty and Netanyahu is innocent, or if it finds vice versa or whatever, people need to accept that is the letter of the law, but no one's going to accept it because there's so much bias in this thing. And what I don't want as a former soldier is I don't really give a shit about the generals and the commands and whatever. I just don't want young private soldiers which if I was born in X country or Y country, I would have been in the group going through extended suffering because no one at the top has the fucking nutsack to say, hey, look, that's a war crime. That's all I want. Is I do wider war is going to happen. War with China, may happen, probably more probable than not. And I don't want a young American or Australian or German or Ukrainian or whatever going through extended suffering. And I also don't want a young Chinese man going through extended suffering either.
Agreed.
I think war is inevitable. We just need to limit how savage that is and the weapons being used, especially while we're at the infancy of things like drones. And we could nip it in the ass now. And if we nipped Ukraine's drone operators in the ass and said that is, then Russia in 12 months' time doesn't have a fucking leg to stand on with this. If we have to look, we have self-policed. China, you are an ally of Russia. They are not we look at what we have done. They're in the wrong. We're going to then veto this, bloody sanction this, blah blah blah. Then we get it's a long thing, but
mate, you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. I might just take that one step further. There's a lot of hypocrisy here too, and I know you're aware of this. This is Israeli, without getting too much into the. Penny Wong, our foreign minister, sent a retired chief of defence force, an Air Force guy, to Binny, over to Israel to oversee or something the Israeli investigation. Came back and wrote this report and said that their targeting is very similar to ours, their investigation similar to blah blah blah. You and I both know that our investigations in this country, so our administrative inquiries in this country are a disgrace, and the Royal Commission identified that. So either he's upplayed ours or he's downplayed. He's either brought the FAM, so their fact-finding missions, right, either down to our level or brought ours up to theirs, because ours are terrible. So he goes over there and essentially found nothing to see here, made a few recommendations, but then by applying those standards incorrectly, it just makes it you can see the bias, right? Penny Wong wanted something to come back saying, "No, they're bad." He came back and said, "Well, no, not that bad, like ours." Sorry, mate, but ours has been proven to be bad, and the Brereton report came out before he went over there. He hasn't read it. But this, so mate, you're right. The bias thing. I might just go full circle quickly, if I may. Just
mate, go for
Kurakhove at the start, and I agreed that we shouldn't be out there making these definitive statements. Things like he was executed, which, as I say, I didn't say, but regardless, it's there in my name, so we're addressing that. If we can get, and this I'm saying this to Mr. Boykov, if we can get determinative proof of life or proof of death, confirmation of death from somebody, then that is what we want to achieve, right? Now, if Mr. Boykov can help us do that, I'm certainly happy to help him facilitate that. He has a vested interest in this because he wants to be. It's like prisoner exchange. He's not actually a prisoner; he's a self-imposed prisoner. But regardless, an exchange between him and Oscar. If we can get if we can get something out of him to assist in identifying and locating our guy, dead or alive. I've got a dog barking in the background now, but then you know what? Whatever it takes to help him, and then say, well, look, he helped this. Let's see what happens in the future, right? But
mate, I think we're all praying that this doesn't go the way of which it's looking.
Absolutely.
And if Mr. Boykov can send me an image, of Miss Jenkins alive. And if it's, we're going to do a swap and he has to fly back with you from Moscow, I'll go pick him up.
That's right. I probably can't, but you can.
I'd be happy to, fly with Boykov there, drop him off and do a prisoner exchange. I'll happily facilitate that and make a fucking good YouTube video too.
Yeah, it would do, absolutely.
I'm hoping it goes that way. And, I'm happy to, we're all happy to see information if that came out. And yourself too. So, is there anything, mate? I know we're going to speak for 20 minutes and we've been an hour and 38.
Mate, these are great talks, though, right?
No, mate, I appreciate your time. I can't afford a lawyer for this amount of time. So,
mate, you raise some great issues. You always raise great issues. I think we've touched on a lot of stuff today, most of which is within my lane. Some was a little bit out, but I've sort of given it a bit of a crack without, lawyers shouldn't dip their toe in stuff, right? But some people dip my toe in a bit today. Mate, no, I think we've covered off really well. There's a few pieces I wouldn't mind exploring in the future, though. There's a couple of bits, bits we can go down a bit more of a pathway.
Please let me know.
One day, I think I wouldn't mind talking about the ICC with you, actually, because I think there's some stuff we can talk about there, particularly since we've got a bunch of Australians now who are being looked at, being investigated, and one's has been charged. And as you know, my PhD on command responsibility, Senator Lambie and I referred our chain of command to the ICC. ICC won't do anything with it. So, of course, even though the Australian government's doing nothing with it, so that's self-inconsistent with the impunity issue at the ICC. So there's a bit of a discussion there later from a soldier on the ground perspective, and then a lawyer sort of looking over the top, maybe down the track.
Yeah, mate, that would be great. Well, mate, look, let you get back to your Saturday afternoon. Mate, look, I really do appreciate your time. If there's anything we've missed, please let me know. And for Mr. Boykov, we know where that stands.
Well, I'm glad he's talking to you. That's a good conduit, right? And if we need to make that a conduit to our government, whatever, then so be it. I think that's a good start.
Yeah, I think that's a good start, mate. Well, look, you look after yourself, and I'll speak to you very soon. Thanks, mate.
Brother. Love your work.
Thanks.